This is the Atari 2600 Plus, specifically the Pac-Man Special Edition. A gorgeous emulation-based system that runs games from real Atari 2600 and 7800 cartridges, much like a real system would. The Atari 2600 Plus is a sister system to the Atari 7800 Plus, which too is a dual system, meaning that it plays Atari 2600 and 7800 games. And the only difference is the outer design. The Pac-Man Edition resembles the original wooden Atari 2600 or VCS design, but with Pac-Man themed colors, whereas the 7800 Plus looks like a Atari 7800 except smaller. So while I will be mostly showing the 2600 Plus Pac-Man Edition in this video, what I'm actually reviewing is the 2600 7800 Plus family of systems and how good of an alternative they are to real Atari 2600 and 7800 hardware, though we will be mostly focusing on 2600 games since I only own two 7800 titles. First, let's get one question out of the way. Just who are these Plus family of systems for? Well, in my opinion, the Atari 2600 7800 Plus systems are for people who want to play Atari 2600 and 7800 games on modern TVs through HDMI without messing with extra plugs, converters, and so forth. They are also for people who already have established libraries of 2600 and 7800 games, or people who are willing to track down and start building their own Atari game libraries now, since the games are for the most part very affordable still. Atari do keep releasing some 2600 and 7800 cartridges. We have new games coming out for the systems as well as old re-releases of popular games for both the 7800 and the 2600. However, their release schedule is, in my opinion, very slow, so you are probably going to be better off tracking down the old cartridges if you're looking for old popular games. Generally, prices for most Atari 2600 games are very low. Most of the best games are easily affordable, though some can be very expensive, such as my beloved Beam Rider and Subterranea, which seem to have drastically gone up in price in recent years, which is a huge problem. This right here is why I consider the lack of SD card support in the 2600 and 7800 Plus consoles to be a huge drawback. Now guys, for the most important question, just how do games actually play on the Atari 2600 7800 Plus family of systems? I already said that these are emulation-based consoles, meaning that there is software inside the console pretending to be an Atari 2600 or 7800. They don't have the actual Atari hardware inside, and that's okay. As someone who actively plays Atari 2600 games for over 30 years on original hardware, I can tell you that there is no noticeable difference whatsoever. You pop your cartridge in, wait a bit for the software to copy the game over to the system, and then you play like normal. In fact, the only difference seems to be the fact that on original hardware, games boot up immediately, and on the Plus systems they take a while to load up. The reason behind this is because, unlike on original hardware where the game instantly reads from the cartridge, on emulation-based systems like this one, the game first needs to be copied to the system's memory. A file needs to be created in a format that the onboard emulator can read and play. So while not instant, the wait time isn't all that bad. All hardware-related controls such as the system's difficulty, game selection and start reset switches and buttons work as they would on real Atari hardware. This is actually very impressive because once the game boots up, you honestly can't tell you're not using a real Atari 2600 or 7800 console. Even the black and white switch functions as it does on real Atari 2600 hardware. I even hooked up the Atari 2600 Pac-Man Edition to one of my CRT TVs using the cheapest HDMI to AV converter I could find, and other than the image being stretched out a little bit, which surprisingly did not bother me for once, the games looked and felt like they were running on real hardware. So whether you play on modern HD TV screens or manage to hook up the system to an old CRT TV, the games will look and play absolutely great. I have a fairly big library of Atari 2600 games and I was able to boot up and successfully play every single one of my single game cards and all except one multi-card. We'll talk about this in a bit. From popular to fairly obscure games, the emulator had no issues detecting and playing any of the games I threw at it. I was even able to successfully play an as of yet undumped bootleg version of Yar's Revenge called Yar's Attack, which I've had since childhood. The Atari 2600 and 7800 Plus, while compatible with many old multi-cards, unfortunately does not work with most currently available flash cards, meaning that it will not work with cartridges that allow the user to add their own games to them. At least that's the case at the time of this recording. So anyone who doesn't mind playing games from real cartridges and wants to discover and enjoy still easily affordable, for the most part, games yet doesn't have a CRT TV or a means to hook up an old RF-based Atari console to their modern TVs will love the Atari 2600 or 7800 Plus system. I was able to play and fully enjoy all of my favorite games on the 2600 regardless of how obscure they may be. With that said, I know that the systems did initially have compatibility issues with some games, but as is the case with pretty much all modern consoles nowadays, the Atari 2600 and 7800 Plus get constant updates that improve compatibility not only with officially released games but also with hardware peripherals and in the end homebrew games. Even though I don't have many 7800 games to choose from, I've seen on YouTube that they now work absolutely perfectly well with the latest firmware updates. Bentley Bear's Crystal Quest, which I do own, is a new 7800 game that runs absolutely beautifully on the consoles, both the 7800 Plus and the 2600 Plus. And the game is an absolute joy to play. Now, speaking of hardware peripherals, one of my favorite Atari 2600 games is Tech Scan. That game is not playable without pedal controllers. I'm happy to report that with the latest firmware update, pedal controllers work like a dream with the Plus systems, both on the 2600 Plus and the 7800 Plus. In fact, I am able to play both Solar Storm and Tech Scan with as much precision and ease as I would on real hardware. I feel no difference between real hardware and the Plus systems now. Granted, these controllers did have compatibility issues before and they can easily break and become janky and wonky and such, but as of now they work beautifully with the Plus systems, so as long as the controllers themselves are fine and well maintained. So what happens if my pedal controllers break? This is a new pair My old one broke long ago. How would I play TAC-SCAN? Well, there is a version of the game that doesn't require pedal controllers on what is one of my favorite cartridges of all time, and that is the 208-in-1 cart. A fairly rare multi-cart which I got only a few years ago off of Etsy and never found another, though it is a known cart and has been dumped years ago. Well, guys, this is the type of multi-cart that is sadly not compatible with the Atari 2600 7800 Plus systems. While many multi-carts, even the ones with menus, work fine, this particular cartridge has the menu set up as a separate ROM, meaning its own independent game that calls up on other games on the cartridge when the number for each game is entered. This, due to the way the Plus systems work, cannot be properly executed at this point. What the 26 and 7800 Plus systems see is the first game that is set to load in the cart's memory upon boot up, and that happens to be the menu in this case. So it takes that, copies it to the console's system memory, but does not read the other games on the cartridge, making it so that all you can load is the menu itself, but not select any of the other games on the cart. This can actually happen on real hardware too, sometimes with this particular cart, but a simple reboot and reinserting of the cart normally fixes that. So, not being able to access the games on the 208-in-1 cartridge cuts me off from a significant portion of my Atari 2600 library, unfortunately, including that TAC-SCAN which does not require pedal controllers. But if you have the games on individual carts or compatible multi-carts, this won't be an issue. This is such an uncommon cartridge that I absolutely do not mind it not being compatible with the Plus systems. I'm lucky to even have found one for cheap the way I did several years ago. However, multi-carts that use switches, which determine which of the multiple games will load in memory when the system is powered on, work perfectly fine. In fact, even modern multi-carts that have been re-released for the Atari 2600 7800 Plus systems, such as the Pac-Man one and other collections, use the switch method to change between games. There are some menu-based old cartridges that also work. These menu-based multi-carts will work perfectly fine. I believe they are official releases, but I could be wrong on that one. I assume the menu and games are all in one single ROM on here, hence why they work. And finally, the popular 32-in-1 cartridge, which changes ROMs in memory every time you power the system on, works just fine as well. However, due to the game's loading process taking longer, getting to the games you want to play may take a while, and that kind of makes this cartridge a little hard and tedious to use. Plus, most of these games can also be found on very cheap single cartridges. Now, this is very important, so hear me out. Since the Atari 2600 did not have standardized cartridge designs and look, plus due to age, plastic changes shape, deforms, expands, and so forth, some old cartridges might have trouble fitting into the 2600 Plus or have trouble getting out. The system initially has an exceptionally firm grip on some cartridges, but this loosens up over time and with use and stops being a problem the more you play and the more you use the console. However, I strongly recommend that you don't insert your most praised, most expensive cartridges right away and wait for the grip to loosen up first. After that, you are good to play whatever you want. It will loosen up within a few days or frequent game switching, which, if you have a big library and like playing different games in short bursts, shouldn't take too long to happen. So guys, as you can see, so far the Atari 2600 and 7800 Plus systems are excellent alternatives to real hardware. Great compatibility, regular systems updates, which I both dread and love, are consistently being worked on by a clearly knowledgeable and very passionate team. In all honesty, these systems are a true labor of love, and unlike Nintendo and Sega, who abandoned their minis rather quickly, the Atari emulation systems seem like they're here to stay for quite a while. But what modern improvements do they offer? Sadly, there aren't many, but what is there can be quite useful. Without a game inserted, you can access a system menu with some very useful features, such as PAL cartridge compatibility, which for me is of utmost importance and is enabled by default. Controller settings to change the controller between one or two button style, as well as some graphics settings. There's bilinear filtering to make your games look smeared and blurry for no good reason. I fail to understand the implementation of this setting because bilinear filtering does nothing to improve the look of these games, and bilinear filters do not simulate pixel blending the way proper CRT filters do, and they only make games look awful. Another, this time actually excellent graphics option lets you adjust the simulated phosphor levels of a CRT screen. Now this option is, in my opinion, of utmost importance and should definitely be adjusted to the user's liking, but only if they use a modern TV to play the system on. If you're on a CRT TV, disable this feature because this CRT screen has this on its own. What this does is it tries to mimic the slight ghosting that appears on CRT screens and does a fairly decent job at it. Had the Plus systems also featured solid curved CRT filters in combination with the effect, games would have genuinely looked stunning even on modern screens. Again, they already look very beautiful as is, but they could have looked even better. Given the system's price, I believe more powerful hardware that could do decent CRT filters should have been implemented. After all, retro handhelds that cost around the same or even less have the capabilities to display some very good CRT filters, and Atari 2600 games actually look better on these systems than they do on the official 7800 and 2600 Plus systems. But even without CRT filters, as long as you keep the awful bilinear filtering disabled and phosphor levels set to your liking, the games will look beautiful on modern screens. Another very welcome feature is the hardware switch that lets you change between aspect ratio of 16:9, meaning the image is stretched out across the screen, and 4:3, which is the aspect ratio used by old CRT TVs that those games were designed for. When playing on an HD TV with a 16:9 resolution, you want to set your Atari system to a 4:3 aspect ratio so that the games aren't stretched out and display correctly. However, when playing on a CRT TV that already has 4:3 aspect ratio, at least with the HDMI to AV converter I found that it's actually better to have the 16:9 aspect ratio enabled on your Atari console. The games will be ever so slightly more stretched out than normal, but will fit the CRT screen well overall. Now, one problem I have with my HDMI to AV converter is that the left side of the screen is slightly cut off. It never affected gameplay for me, but it is something to note. Other HDMI to AV converters might not even have this issue. However, none of this would have been a problem if the developers implemented a manual screen size picture size adjustment feature, which I think could be done with future firmware updates. The lack of this option is not a negative, it's just something that I think would be a nice addition and I figured I would mention. The controllers each system comes with will feel authentic and will be instantly familiar to those who grew up on or have played Atari 2600 or 7800 before. Now, even as a kid, I much preferred the D-pad style controllers that came with my Atari 2600 Junior over the original joysticks. And that's the case with their modern counterparts as well. The D-pad style controllers are very responsive and excellent for both 8 and 4-way games, whereas the joysticks, well, pretty looking, in my experience have a major issue with certain 4-way games such as Pac-Man, meaning if you accidentally hit a diagonal and the game isn't programmed to recognize diagonals as one of the 4 directions, your character will remain unresponsive. This is a big problem. And this is the case with the Pac-Man games both for the original 2600 version and the newly released 7800 one, but not with Miss Pac-Man on the 2600 at least, that's the one I have. That one works just fine even with the joystick. For 8-weight games, however, the joysticks are absolutely great. They are excellent, very responsive and fun to use. They can even perform some minor, almost micro movements, which is very important for shmups such as Subterranea, X-Mission and so on. At the end, it all comes down to preference. I like the aesthetics of the joysticks a lot, but I'd still much prefer using the D-pad for gaming. And you can buy all these controllers separately, so if you happen to dislike the joysticks, you can buy yourself D-pad style controllers and the other way around. There's plenty of them available wherever they sell the Atari 2600 Plus systems. Now, initially, the D-pad on the new controller won't be as precise as your old ones, most likely. At least that was the case with mine. I was surprised when I was unable to finish the final level of Mr. Postman, which is one of the few Atari 2600 games that requires actual pixel perfect precision. So I had no choice but to hook up one of my old 2600 Junior controllers to get past that level. Fortunately, the 2600 and 7800 Plus are compatible with old wired controllers, no problem. However, after breaking the controller in, the new D-pad became more precise and much more responsive. The new controller buttons still have slightly longer travel than I'd like to, but that's not that big of a deal. So, bottom line is the new controllers, both joysticks and D-pad controllers, are actually very good and very well made. They might just need some time to break in. Overall, the Plus systems are a great Atari 2600 and 7800 alternative. The fact that its emulation is not an issue at all. In fact, with future firmware updates, it could actually prove beneficial. However, the biggest offender, the biggest problem with these systems is the lack of an SD card slot, which would have allowed us to add our own games. This right here is an even bigger problem than the lack of solid CRT filters, in my opinion. It really hinders the systems. We have to understand that these old cartridges, while sturdy, can and will break over time. For example, my Kung Fu Master for the 2600 is dead and has been so for several years now. It is clearly some kind of internal damage, making the cartridge impossible to play on real hardware or the Plus systems. I have the same problem with my Nexar cartridge, and the only Nexar alternative I have happens to be on that 208-in-1 cartridge, which isn't compatible with the Plus systems. Guys, these old cards won't last forever. Tomorrow I might find my Beam Rider or Subterranea dead, and neither one of those is easy or cheap to replace. This would significantly damage my overall Atari 2600 experience, and not having an SD card to play these games on will make my 2600 experience really lacking. So if I were a new buyer and my favorite games were broken and impossible to obtain, I would have thought about buying a Plus system twice, because if I can't play my favorite games on it, and if I have to pay almost as much as the system itself to re-obtain those games, it's just not worth it. And this right here is where an SD card feature would have been exceptionally beneficial. Furthermore, the 2600, 7800 Plus systems can clearly dump games, meaning copy games, from the cartridges easily and rather quickly. What happens if my Yarsa tag dies? I have never found or seen another Yars Attack cartridge on eBay or out in the wild. This is an undumped bootleg version of Yars Revenge with some minor differences, and is downright impossible to find nowadays. If we had an SD card in the system and the option to save our dumps to that SD card, I could have dumped the ROM for preservation purposes. So no guys, relying on these old cartridges alone in this day and age is not a good idea. The lack of an SD card slot and the lack of the ability to save dumped games to said SD card is a huge, massive negative in my opinion. But other than that, if you don't care about this particular aspect, the Atari 2600 and 7800 Plus is an outstanding, wonderful system and a great modern alternative to the original Atari 2600 and 7800. Now guys, it's very important to understand that in this review I purposely did not focus on the design itself or the packaging, because there are plenty of videos on YouTube out there that cover these aspects. I wanted to share the actual gaming experience that the Atari 2600 7800 Plus offer. I play Atari 2600 games in summer all the time, and I have been playing them for over 30 years now. I have a big library of real games for the system, and I wanted to focus on what truly matters, not the boxes, packaging and such, but the actual gameplay experience itself. So is the Atari 2600 Plus Pac-Man Edition worth the price? I would honestly say it is slightly overpriced, but at the same time it offers a brand new and almost seamless Atari 2600 and 7800 experience right out of the box, and it is already updated with the best possible firmware at this point, meaning you don't have to go to the simple but rather somewhat tedious firmware update process that not everybody can easily do if they are not at least a little bit computer savvy. If the beautiful yellow Pac-Man design isn't to your liking, you can always pick up 7800 Plus models for less, update to the latest firmware yourself, and you'll be having the same great experience as if you just bought the 2600 Plus Pac-Man Edition. However, there is one thing that I read, I could be wrong on this, but the first 2600 Plus models seem to be a little different in terms of internal hardware compared to the 7800 and the 2600 Plus Pac-Man Edition, so I can't guarantee that you will have the exact same experience if you buy one of those, but I can guarantee that your experience will be the same if you get a 7800 Plus, because I already have this system and it's absolutely great. Every bit as good as the Atari 2600 Plus Pac-Man Edition once fully updated. Now, again, the update process for me personally is not overly complicated or anything, but as updates tend to be, they can be somewhat stressful, and I know that people who are not computer savvy might find the update process confusing and tedious, which in my opinion is one of the biggest negatives of modern hardware in general. So overall, the Atari 2600 7800 Plus is a wonderful, outstanding console that's only going to get better with time with proper updates. If you're okay with the price and enjoy playing simple, easy to pick up and play games, I strongly recommend you get yourself one.